In my World War I playlist, I have already talked about the main participants and even smaller belligerents like Bulgaria and Romania. However, the USA is still missing, which is why I'm adding a new episode specifically about America's entry and participation, explaining why and how this great overseas nation benefited from the conflict. In 1914, America, under President Wilson, stayed neutral, mainly because the country had traditionally stayed out of European conflicts, but also because the public was divided. Irish, German, and Scandinavian immigrants supported neutrality, while the WASP establishment was pro-Entente. The United States was already the largest economy in the world, but it maintained a tiny army, which was smaller than that of Bulgaria. At the same time, the US Navy was expanding, approaching their German and British rivals in size, which Britain didn't mind, as they had already acknowledged the existence of an American sphere of influence long before the war. At home, support for neutrality remained strong, although over time they started to erode. Pacifism was present as always. The socialists were strongly in favor of peace, while the Republicans kickstarted the preparedness movement, advocating a strong buildup of naval and land forces for defensive purposes. They assumed that America would have to fight sooner or later, so the 100,000-strong army and the 112,000-man National Guard were inadequate, and thus, every year, at least 600,000 men should be required to undergo a 6-month military training, and this way, a large reserve force could be created. The Democrats, who originally came from the South, viewed this as a threat and stuck to localism, even attempting to cut the military budget in 1915. Almost immediately, the US started supplying ammunition to Britain and her allies, supporting their war effort. This had nothing to do with Entente sympathies, it was strictly business, but they could not deliver the same products to the Central Powers due to the British naval blockade. Rifle and machine gun cartridges were followed by wheat and other foodstuffs, artillery shells and rifles, and even locomotives, of which more than 5,000 were delivered domestically and to Britain, France, and Russia. Some enterprises, like the United States Cartridge Company, experienced a boom, which lasted until the end of the war. Efficiency increased over time. 1918 was their best year. In the early years of the conflict, the British Empire, more precisely Great Britain itself, managed to finance the war effort, providing loans and shipments of goods to the other Entente powers. However, by 1917, Britain ran out of gold reserves, overseas investments, and even private credit, so it started borrowing from the US Treasury. Most of this money was used to pay for American goods, especially ammunition and artillery shells, along with explosives, as the American factories were churning out smokeless powder in unprecedented quantities. This allowed the US to pay back all its foreign debt, and by the end of the war, to become a net lender, just like Japan, although on a much larger scale. The country's huge distance from the front lines allowed it to take advantage of the conflict, while its European rivals were exhausting each other militarily and economically. The political infighting flared up again when the Lusitania was sunk in May 1915 by a German submarine close to the Irish coast. This was interpreted as a merciless attack on innocent civilians, even though the German embassy had issued a preemptive warning to the American public, which ironically appeared in the newspapers right next to the announcement of Lusitania's next voyage, and the ship didn't even follow the usual cautionary measures as it approached unsafe waters. It is also very likely that besides the passengers, the ship was transporting ammunition to Britain, violating international agreements, thus becoming a valid target for German U-boats. Hundreds of civilians died when the ship sunk, but it was an excellent propaganda piece to justify entry to the war. This did not happen, as President Wilson resisted such calls, while former President Roosevelt ate his hat as he was raging about the incompetence of his successor. At least the expansion of the Navy could commence, but this also provoked a debate, as the admirals wanted more capital ships, not destroyers that could be more useful against enemy submarines. No lessons were drawn from the war. Trench warfare, poison gas, tanks, or airplanes were not studied in detail. At least motorization progressed, with thousands of four-wheel drive trucks delivered to the Army and foreign customers. In 1916, poor harvest led to wheatless Wednesdays and meatless Tuesdays, while Congress reached a compromise regarding preparedness, increasing the Army to 220,000 men. The House turned down spending on the Navy, but after the Battle of Jutland, proponents of a naval buildup pushed through new legislation to build more capital ships. The Army soon became busy with Mexican raiders, forces of Pancho Villa, that had attacked people on U.S. soil dozens of times. 140,000 National Guard troops were called up to watch the border, while General John J. Pershing led an expeditionary force into Mexico. They won a few engagements, but were unable to catch Villa, and since war with Mexico was to be avoided, they were recalled in January 1917. Over the border, anti-American sentiment grew. The new year started with the German decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare around Great Britain. They also invited Mexico to join the war as their ally, but the Zimmerman telegram was intercepted by the British, who handed it over to the Americans. A few more U.S. merchant ships were sunk, after which Congress voted on the declaration of war, approving it on the 6th of April. Conscription was introduced, but mobilization of the economy was hindered by confusion, which could only be remedied by early 1918. The income tax was raised, new business taxes were introduced, and Liberty bonds were issued to raise money for the war. Millions enlisted, so women took men's jobs in large numbers. It took months to train and equip the new recruits, so at first only 14,000 men arrived in France. They used British and French equipment, as their own military did not provide any tanks, airplanes, artillery, or even helmets. The American Expeditionary Force was established in July 1917, after which more and more men were transported to Europe in large convoys that were well protected against submarines. The first engagement of 1st Division took place in October, but by January, 5 more divisions joined them. 4 of them were deployed in a training area near Verdun, so after a few small attacks, the first major operation came only in June 1918, when Marines and 2 infantry divisions stopped a German attack at Belleauwood, suffering 10,000 casualties. This was followed by the first offensive, together with the Australian Corps, in early July, in the Battle of Hamel. By that time, the German army had run out of steam. It could no longer replace the heavy losses it had suffered in the spring offensive, not to mention that back home, near starvation levels had been reached. By September, the U.S. First Army was ready to go on the attack, which it did in the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, taking large numbers of German prisoners. In these battles, the AEF had evolved into a modern army, while 1 regiment fought in Italy, and 2 others arrived in Russia to participate in their civil war. By the armistice in November 1918, casualties reached 320,000, with 52,000 dead, but by then, the influenza pandemic had also started to take more lives. Demobilization followed. More than 3 million men were discharged by mid-1919. At the end of the war, the United States had the chance to become a superpower, but instead it chose isolation, enjoying a decade of prosperity, followed by more trouble in the 1930s. I will talk about that in a future video. Until then, see you around.